All right. Well, welcome back, everybody. I am going to introduce our next session. And our next session is entitled How Criminals Sneak Counterfeit Drugs into the Supply Chain. And I'd like to welcome the Executive Director of the Partnership for Safe Medications, Shabbir. And after his presentation, I will come around and use one of the microphone to ask questions. So raise your hand after he's done, and I'll bring around to you questions. So, welcome. Shabbir, we're ready for you.
I can't tell if that was an indication for me to start because it's kind of muffled. Okay, well, I think that was an indicator to start, so I'm going to go ahead and go. Thank you, everybody, for giving me an hour of your time. My name is Shabbir Safdar. I'm the Executive Director of the Partnership for Safe Medicines. We are a 20-year-old non-for-profit that studies counterfeit medicines. And I'm going to talk about the different ways in which we've seen counterfeits sneak into the U.S. supply chain. Just to give you a sense of perspective of how I come at this issue, my organization is a 501c6, which is made up only of other nonprofits and trade associations. So primarily, I'm representing pharmacists. That's the largest category of members that I have. We don't have any for-profits that give us support or resources. That's just a decision about where we want to be as an organization. But we represent everybody in the supply chain. If you touch a medicine from the factory floor to the patient, you're represented somehow in our collection. We have a number of reports that I'm not going to go over specifically, but we study things like pill press seizures, the spread of specific kinds of counterfeits like fake Adderall, also counterfeit medicines and counterfeit pills being sold through social media like Snapchat. And you can find a lot of our stuff out there. In particular, if you happen to have LinkedIn and you're always looking for content, I urge you to go on to LinkedIn and share material once a week. It'll keep your LinkedIn profile alive. And as my 14-year-old tells me, she's embarrassed by the fact that we have our videos on TikTok. So if you're looking for something on TikTok that's not dancing, I've got you covered. So let's talk about the first way and the primary way, in my opinion, that consumers get access to counterfeit medicines, at least American ones, and that is that they buy it themselves. As you know, there has been a rush of excitement and enthusiasm around the diabetes, semaglutide, and related products. And there is, in some cases, been shortages that are shortages of manufacturing. In some cases, there's shortages of insurance coverage, right? It doesn't matter if there's enough of a medicine. If your insurance doesn't cover it, then for all practical purposes, it's out of reach for you. And so we've been seeing a number of different kinds of Ozempic and other related diabetic pen products counterfeited. This in particular is one of the two kinds of counterfeits that has us very concerned. It's an insulin pen that has been relabeled as a semaglutide pen. They basically just put new stickers on it and proceeded to sell it. And if you know a little bit about insulin, and you know that if you're not in need of it, getting insulin, getting a large dose of insulin can actually be a life-threatening experience. And we've seen two instances of patient harm. This This is primarily ordered by consumers over the internet. And I'm not going to spend too much time talking about illegal online pharmacies because I know that Elliot, my colleague from the Alliance for Safe Online Pharmacies, is going to talk at length about that. But there is a great deal of danger in how consumers endanger themselves here. And we've seen this starting in lesser developed countries, Nigeria, etc., and it's moved into the EU. The big news last week and the 2 weeks before was that it was found in Austria and Germany. So, for all practical purposes, you can assume that the entire EU now has a counterfeit weight loss pen problem. And we're going to probably see more and more of it spreading around the EU, which will up the number of countries from 13. Incidentally, it did appear in the US. And again, it was, in this case, it was found in a retail pharmacy. So we believe that there is a pharmacist who probably bought this online and sold it to a patient and probably regrets that now. This is the second way, and this is actually a more recent development that we're seeing these counterfeits enter the supply chain. It's primarily, in this case, through med spas, which you've seen probably that some of the manufacturers of these injectable weight loss products suing med spas. But what they're doing is they're going on places like Etsy and they're buying what they believe is the active ingredient, which is being sold for research purposes only and not by someone who has any kind of board of pharmacy license, and they're selling it to people to inject. And this is in no way safe. And the fact that we've gotten to this point as a society where people are willing to inject themselves with what they believe is the active ingredient with no medical or chemical knowledge uh, to guide them is pretty terrifying. And one of the sad things is that the platforms like Etsy, but in particular Etsy, are turning a blind eye to this kind of dangerous sales behavior. Um, there are active ingredients for medical products that are not even past FDA approval that are being sold on Etsy by people who are excited about starting their entrepreneurial weight loss medical spa business. So this is a new edge in the frontier. There's another way that we've seen counterfeiters get these products into the US, and that is actually through, believe it or not, people who believe that they're managing their insurance. So this is some research we've done about 6, 7 years ago, which is actually coming back, roaring back as a new category. And it's a little complex and it's very cynical once I explain it to you. Let's say that you're a small business with 40 employees and you've got insurance. And every year there's a survey of the medical needs and the ages of your participants, and then your insurance company determines your premium. And what's happening is that in small towns and in school board districts around the country, these entities are getting pitched by an insurance strategy broker who says, if your premiums, your cost of your healthcare plan is being driven by a couple of people with a really high utilization, right? They have some maintenance medication which is driving the overall cost of your premium up. If you could take them out of the insurance pool, your overall costs would go down. And so and and so they're thinking about how they do that, right? How do we shunt off this, these two or three people who have relatively high cost maintenance medications out of the pool to make the overall costs go down? And there are consultants that will come in and will say, okay, they've got two ways to help you. The first is that, let's say it's a blood thinner that's driving your cost up. Let's take the blood thinner off the formulary so that the patient can now honestly say, I am not covered by health insurance. And then that patient applies to the manufacturer of the blood thinner claiming that they are not covered by insurance. And because of that, can you provide free medication? When I say that what I was going to tell you is very cynical, it's because that patient has insurance. The people that operate the insurance plan are just too cheap to actually pay for their medication. So that's a terrible thing. They're not insured for that medication, but the fact that it was intentionally removed so they could qualify for indigent patient programs is particularly terrifying. And if they don't qualify, one of their go-to methods, and this is how counterfeits get into the US drug supply, is that they shunt them to a prescription drug broker, an international broker, who will have them get their medicine fulfilled by pharmacies in foreign countries, not licensed by the Board of Pharmacy in their state, and not under any obligation to distribute and dispense to them actual FDA approved medications. Right? They'll tell you that it will come from maybe the Canada or the United Kingdom or Australia or New Zealand, but in point of fact, you might in fact be getting a counterfeit from any one of a number of countries that is not in that list of four. And we've seen this many, many times. And of course, you immediately sign away your rights when you sign up for this. The savings here is so great that typically what happens in these schemes is that these individuals will have all of their costs covered. There'll be no copay. There'll be not even a cost to the entity. The entity will pay some small fee. Now, when we did our first research about these dangerous medication brokers, we found them in many, many small towns all across Massachusetts. And then indeed, when we looked nationwide, we actually saw them a great deal in the Northeast with some clusters in the Midwest. So there's a particular danger here in these entities spreading, and there's more than one. It used to be just one called Canna RX, but it's now spread, and there's a whole industry of insurance strategists that will help you peel off the people with the most expensive medications and shunt them to a risky dispenser in order to save money. Obviously, this is not safe. When these people dispense counterfeits, which is particularly normal, there's no recourse for the patient. What you're basically doing is asking the patient to take on extra risk to save you money, which is particularly dangerous. Keeping on the theme of consumers bringing in counterfeits and endangering themselves, early in 2022, we were made aware of an outbreak of counterfeit medicine from Mexican border pharmacies or Mexican tourist pharmacies, like in Cancun, by the Pharmaceutical Security Institute. And what they had found, and this came through the manufacturers, is that patients were calling the manufacturers saying that their blood thinners were not effective. And they got some calls from both physicians who were monitoring the state of the patients and also the patients themselves. And so they chased down this story. And what they found was that the patients had gone to a border pharmacy in Mexico and bought their blood thinner. And these are three actual photos of blood thinners bought by undercovers working for the manufacturers that they found that were completely placebo. These medicines have no medicine in them. They are just chalk tablets pressed in the shape of the real pills. And so you can see the Xarelto and the Eliquis, interestingly, that they're made and counterfeited. The labels are counterfeited in Mexico, but they're in English, right? You would think, how is it possible that medicine sold in Mexico is in English? That's not the native language of the country. It should be in Spanish. But we know that these are counterfeited for a number of reasons. There are errors on the label. If you look at the Eliquis and you kind of turn your head sideways, you can see that the UPC code for it is 0123456789123, which I can assure you is not the UPC code of Eliquis. What is particularly disturbing is that the counterfeiters were like, I wonder if someone's so clever that they're going to insist that they want a Mexican Spanish labeled version of this product. Well, we'll make one and we'll translate the label into Spanish, which is what you see at the top right. This was quite a big deal. As far as I know, it's still going on. There have been no arrests made. I think there's probably an open investigation. But as you know, it's not easy for Americans to investigate Mexican nationals in Mexico without the cooperation. If you've not been to a border pharmacy in Mexico, this is basically what it looks like. If you go from Yuma to Los Algodones, Uh, it's about 15 minutes drive. Whatever time it takes you to get through the checkpoint is another issue. But once you cross over, there's easily a half a dozen border pharmacies designed to cater to Americans crossing the border for cheap medication. If you live anywhere in the border or have visited the border of Europe and have gone from, Finland to Estonia, you see like boats, ferries full of Finns going over, basically taking advantage of cheap prices in Estonia, and they will carry back everything they can physically carry because that's what's allowed. And it's the same thing with these. And you walk into Los Algodones and you see uh, stores like this. Basically, the Purple Pharmacy is a very popular chain, and they've got their pricing written on a whiteboard. They know that their customers are Americans, and they absolutely know that they are going to buy it. And they also know that there's actually no recourse for an American who gets a counterfeit from one of these pharmacies, right? It's not even clear they could get their money back, much less if they had a stroke from an ineffective blood thinner, if they could actually do anything about it. In 2022, when we were very concerned about this problem, it also happened that a pharmacy benefit manager had taken a blood thinner off their formulary. And so we think that a lot of patients and doctors were starting to scramble because they didn't want to have to switch the patient to a new blood thinner. Non-medical switching is actually not in the patient's best interest, and it puts you at risk of having a medical adverse event while you get the dosage right for the new medicine. The issue with pharmacies in Mexico selling counterfeit medicines is actually not a new one. My founder was actually going back and forth across the US Mexico border 23 years ago when he began to think about starting the Partnership for Safe Medicines. And he was finding and following Americans who were buying cheaper medicines like Lipitor, which is a statin, which is now heavily generic now and so costs almost nothing, uh, and testing it in his lab and finding that it was also counterfeit or completely substandard. Nowadays, the big problem is that these licensed pharmacies in Mexico with licensed pharmacists are selling counterfeit opioids. And so these are examples of actual fake product that the LA Times and Vice purchased when they went to licensed pharmacies and got medicine dispensed by licensed pharmacists to them. And it is, I think, hard for Americans to imagine that this is a risk, that a licensed pharmacy with a licensed pharmacist is going to sell you counterfeit medicine. It's absolutely not even in the risk profile of what Americans think of, but tons of Americans are finding it. The LA Times went down there repeating some research from UCSD and found over and over and over again that their fentanyl test strips would test positive for what was supposed to be a hydrocodone that came out of a licensed pharmacy, but was instead a fentanyl pill. Now, it's assumed, and there's been some research by Vice News, that the cartels are actually operating that. Whether or not the pharmacists are happily or reluctantly participating in this is another story. But we don't consider a licensed pharmacy in Mexico anymore a safe source of medicine. Frankly, if we did ever. And the problem in Mexico is not just limited to opioids, which are obviously an in-demand product by people who are engaging in drug-seeking behavior. We see it the uh, the world of all therapeutic medicine. So these are some counterfeit arthritis treatments that were found that are basically just saline in a bottle, and if you're lucky, they're sterile saline in a bottle. One of the problems that you see with counterfeit injectables is that they're actually not sterile, which has its own dangers. And so the medicine is produced, the trademarks are copied illegally, the boxes are printed in English, all designed to appeal and make them look more reliable, both to Americans, but even to Mexican healthcare professionals who might think that an English labeled box is more reliable to be not counterfeit than one that's labeled in Spanish. So I want to talk about one of the earliest cases, and this technique still exists today, although it's not as popular, but it is the story of how counterfeits got into the U.S. drug supply chain. It's probably the most well-known story. It was profiled in this book, Dangerous Doses, which is by Catherine Eban, which is still the standard for page turners when it comes to counterfeits. This is Maxine Blunt, and this is the Procrit that she took as part of her post-oncology medication. She's actually from Missouri, in part of Missouri where I'm from. And she ended up getting this counterfeit. And if you look at these two examples of the real and the fake that was at question in her counterfeit outbreak, they're almost indistinguishable, right? This is a fake counterfeited label, and it's absolutely not in any way easily distinguished. Even if you handled this every day, you probably would have just passed right by this slight misprint in the sixth without even being able to identify it. And this counterfeiting technique is something you should know about. It's called uplabeling, and it is possible when you have multiple dosage forms of a drug in a similar package. And so that's what happened here. This Epigen is in 2,000, 10,000, and 20,000 units per milliliter configuration, and they look very, very similar. And so here's how they did it. And this is the story that Catherine Eban tells in her book. A pharmacist broke the rules and sold over 100,000 vials of counterfeit Epigen to an individual without 100,000 plus prescriptions. And that individual took this low dose Epigen and soaked off the labels, I kid you not, in old paint cans in a Florida trailer park. So now he had the vials, ostensibly with real medicine in it, but not kept under any kind of temperature control, and proceeded to print the new higher dose labels and apply them. In that moment, every vial went from $25 wholesale cost to $470 wholesale cost. You can multiply the profit in that one vial by 100,000 and figure out why this was a profitable operation for a criminal. It made an enormous sum of money in a very short time. But the next step was key, and we still see this today. Even if we don't see as much uplabeling, what we saw then was a series of very sketchy wholesalers who sold the medicine for a slight increasing amount of money to each other until they finally got to someone who was willing to sell it back to one of the three prime wholesalers, which still exist today, who had at that time a special revenue division for buying medicine off the gray market and then wholesaling it back into the supply chain. And the problem here is that because without the Drug Supply Chain Security Act's traceability, they would take this medicine they bought from the gray market, which unknown to them was uplabeled. It was low, substandard. And they would take it and they would put it in the warehouse right next to the stuff that had come straight from the factory. Once it made it into the supply chain, it's like getting poison injected into your veins. It went everywhere. And so we had these cases all over the country. Part of the problem here is that in the late 90s and early 2000s, you could probably get a wholesale license for $200 if you had a fax machine and a clean criminal record in South Florida. Right, there was just a lot of paper wholesalers, in many cases buying and selling medicine that didn't even go through their hands, right? It never even left the original warehouse where it was. But what was key about this scheme was that they knew they couldn't sell to pharmacists or wholesalers at too big of a discount. So they would basically ensure that by the time they were get ready to sell back to a prime or to a pharmacy, that they had the price only a little bit cheaper than what they would normally get it for, which is key to making the crime believable, right? If you are offered a Gucci purse that's $1,000 for $20, you know it's a fake. There's absolutely no way you don't know it's a fake, and you take that into account. But if you see someone offering it for $950, you actually think that maybe this is the real thing. So you can actually see on our website the both the story and the grand jury report that came out when Governor Bush was it Governor Bush? Yeah, I think it was Jeb Bush who was governor at the time. You can see the grand jury report with the policy recommendations that came out for what was going to happen afterwards as a response. And you can also see the story if you just scan that QR code. So let's talk about another way that counterfeits get into the supply chain. And this is actually very active today. And I'll give you the shortcut to this. This is through doctors, right? Because after consumers, doctors are probably the most weak point in the supply chain. So in 2012, the FDA discovered a couple of counterfeit lots of this medicine Avastin, which is actually made in the US, and the lots had no active ingredient. It turns out in some cases the bottles were also not sterile, which, since this is given in an infusion chair, this is a pretty serious event. This was part of a long investigation which revealed this issue and had been going on for some time. And just to make sure I level set this, there's at least one patient that we know of that received this and expired after going through a treatment of what appeared to be just placebo treatment, which is Betty Hunter. And her son has gone on the record several times and spoken about his anger about this. So what happened is that if you're familiar with the world of online unlicensed pharmacies, illegal online pharmacies, you know that many of them come out of Winnipeg, Manitoba. And those entities made a lot of money with their websites selling substandard medicine that's not from Canada, but is drop shipped or transshipped through Canada to Americans. And at some point, they realized that there was a whole other market that they didn't know how to sell to, but would love to, which is doctors, right? If you're an oncologist in independent practice, not in a hospital, you actually buy your own medicine. If you're in a hospital, there's a purchasing department and a pharmacy department, and they are not doing anything sketchy at all. They're following the book. But if it's you in an independent practice, you've got a business manager in the office who's buying copier paper, lunch for the staff, coffee, and the oncology medicine that you're giving to your patients in the infusion chairs that you also purchased. And so these entities in Canada figured out that if they could figure out how to import cheaper medicines like Avastin that oncologists administer in office, they could sell it to them, and the oncologist would make extra profit. Right? If you normally sell it for $5,000 a vial and you can get it for $2,000 a vial and sell it to the physician for $4,000 a vial, the physician makes an extra $1,000 a vial. And a lot of them took it. And along the way, they figured out that part of the scheme that had to exist to give the physicians plausible deniability was to set up resale shops and sales shops in the US. So you ended up with these entities in Tennessee and Montana whose purpose was to sell you medicine and allow you to believe that you were dealing with an American wholesaler. In fact, they had American wholesale licenses, but they were basically importing the medicine from non-FDA approved sources overseas. And the counterfeit product, which was traced by the Wall Street Journal, went through this series of countries, which gave it some sheen of respectability before it got to the US, right? The physician in question is certainly not going to take a medicine and give it to patients that came from Turkey. But if it came from the UK, they might actually, and they still do today, believe that it's a little bit safer. These are examples of the medicine. As you can see, as it came out of Turkey, it had Arabic writing on it. And that is, in some cases, what actually tripped the warnings of some physicians who refused to give it to their patients. In other cases, the physicians just glossed right over it. Obviously, no medicine approved by the A, no labeling, no boxes that had foreign language writing would ever be allowed in the U.S. supply chain, right? Because it's not in the native language of the country. What's more appalling is that when when the investigations and the prosecution started to become public, we learned that in some cases, these cold chain oncology products, if they were sent to a physician and they arrived warm, they would be returned, and Canada Drugs would actually re-refrigerate the product, often with lunch ice packs, which is completely not satisfactory for keeping cold chain medicine cold, and then reship it to customers, sometimes to the same customers. And as long as it arrived cold, they would turn a blind eye to what was happening. These people have absolutely no regard, of course, for patient harm. The FDA did a lot of work to unravel this scheme, and as part of it, they got the customer lists of every one of those U.S. salespeople and the Canadian entities, and then they began to issue warning letters to everybody they could find that they'd done business with. And so these warning letters were made public, which allowed my team a chance to actually plot them on a map. And we found hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them in 48 states across the country. Basically, if there's a population center, there's an oncologist. And if there's an oncologist, there's people who did business with sketchy entities. So I can tell you, no matter where you live, you were not more than a half hour's drive from one of these sketchy oncologists. Prosecution of this is very challenging. One of the problems, like in Betty Hunter's case, Betty Hunter passed away. Uh, would she have had 5 more years? Could she have had a shot at remission? Those are all possibilities, but she passed away. And every time it was brought up in any kind of judicial proceeding or in any kind of regulatory proceeding, like with the physician that bought the cheap medicine and gave it to her, the lawyer's defense was that she had cancer, she was going to die anyway. And you cannot prove that the medicine that I injected her with was fake. Why? Because if it was saline, it left no tag. There's no way after the fact to do that. In fact, we just saw here in San Francisco a cosmetic physician who injected over $1 million worth of product, some of which was from boxes with completely illegal lot numbers. So they had to have been counterfeit into patients. And I saw the judge say, there's no proof that it was counterfeit, right? Nobody dropped dead from it. Well, that may be true, but that doesn't prove that it wasn't counterfeit. So we've actually gone through and done an analysis of the prosecutions from this era of American counterfeit history, and they're in this handout, which if you scan the QR code, you can get on our website, or you can just find it on our website if you go to safemedicines.org. I will warn you that not a lot of doctors go to jail for doing this. So if you're the kind of person who has a little bit of outrage left in you, you're going to be outraged after you read it. I want to talk now about what I would consider to be the most expensive, most profitable, and most heinous counterfeit crime I've ever worked on, and probably will work on for the rest of my life. And this is happening now. It's still in the process of being unraveled. There are still probably patients being hurt by it, and there are still criminals making money off of it. But it also gives me some hope, and so I'll show you why that is. Because we're going to talk about at the end of this, what is the Drug Supply Chain Act? How does it work, and how can it be useful in finding crime? Many pharmacists around the country got a letter just like this. Basically, a specialty wholesaler who has a Board of Pharmacy or Department of Business Regulation license to be a pharmaceutical wholesaler. They're not random people. These are people that have been through the process and are holding a valid license. Offer a pharmacist a very slightly discounted HIV or Hep C medication. Sometimes it's also PrEP. And it's not too cheap to be believable. It's 5% off of WAC or 12% off of WAC. It's never 50% off of WAC, which would be an obvious sign of a counterfeit. And every pharmacist I know would be like, I am not interested. Even this stuff makes them nervous, right? Pharmacists are very often very careful about this. Obviously, every profession has bad apples, but pharmacists I've found are rarely the weak point in terms of counterfeit medicines. In addition, because the law says you have to require it, these hucksters offer a DSCSA transaction log. And I've spoken to pharmacists who have made these purchases, and I've asked them, did that make it seem more legitimate? They're like, oh, yeah. Like if I have a whole transaction log of how this got from the manufacturer to me, I absolutely do believe that, it makes it seem way more legitimate. So a pharmacist in Texas who runs a community pharmacy in a small town, and the pharmacy is named for his dad, who I believe started it, bought some of this HIV medicine, right? And let's remember where we've been. For all of us over the age of 50, we lived through an era in which that diagnosis was a death sentence, right? It was like, okay, you've got 6 months, a year, 2 years to live at most, and then you're gone. We've now moved from that through the period where you had to take 700 pills a day, I'm exaggerating, just to stay alive, and maybe it would keep you alive, to now when you can basically take one pill a day and the virus is undetectable and you are untransmittable. It's the place where we've been to where we've got to is amazing. You can live a normal life with a once a day HIV pill regimen. It's just amazing that we've bought so many people so much life. So counterfeiting in this area is particularly heinous. So this Texas pharmacist with his community pharmacy bought this medicine and he got this serial number transaction log. And it showed it coming from the manufacturer to a major wholesaler, from the wholesaler to a couple entities whose names I've made up. There's no Real Joe's Meds LLC. Don't go looking for bargains there. And then to him. And the problem was that he was part of a buying group that also bought from the same major drug wholesaler who told him that he gets the best price. He said, your network of community pharmacies is 50,000 strong. You 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 buy enough volume that you get the best pricing tier. No one gets better pricing than you. And yet here he was holding a medicine cheaper than that came through the same entity. And he decided that that must be a lie. And so he emails the wholesaler, the major wholesaler, and he says, look, I've got this sales history. I got this medicine. It's cheaper than what you offer. It went through your warehouses. Show me why it is that you're lying to us and our community pharmacy buying group is not getting the best price. And what they said to him was, the DSCSA requires us to look through to keep our records for 6 years about all medicine that goes through our warehouses by serial number, and that serial number has never been in a warehouse anywhere in this country. What you're holding is completely fake. And that was a really interesting moment, right? He knew the transaction log had to be fake. He knew the medicine was either counterfeit or diverted, but neither one of those is safe to give patients. And then he did the one thing he's not supposed to do, because this medicine is $3,000 a bottle, is he returned it to the criminal wholesaler to get his money back. He should have quarantined it, and that's a sad event. But he was terrified of the bankruptcy event that comes when you actually have 10 bottles of $3,000 medicine that is suddenly fake. In the same way that if you have $300 bills that are counterfeit, no one's giving you replacements for those. They're suddenly worth $0. And so he returned it, should have quarantined it. We can quibble about that later. He did not give it to patients, which is what I care about. And if you want to read a longer story and some of the videos we've made about this, you can scan that QR code. So this scam, this was part of a larger scam. He was the tip of the iceberg. What was happening is that we were seeing little clues in the news because the investigations were still sealed in court. But both Janssen and Gilead had said that we are aware of counterfeits. Here's some tips to take to avoid buying counterfeits from criminal wholesalers, but we can't say any more. And then in the beginning of 2022, the Wall Street Journal did a story about the civil case, which was unsealed at the request of a number of entities, and the manufacturers prosecuting it did not object. So you've heard about what the scam is like from the pharmacy side. Let me talk about what was going on in the larger scam and why it was so big. Basically, what was happening is that I call this the collector scheme. Criminals were collecting empty or full bottles of medicine from indigent patients. Let's say that you are on a Medicaid program and you get your HIV medicine for very cheap, or PrEP medicine because you're in a risk category but you're homeless and you get your medicine for cheap. Someone will come along, and if they haven't already asked you to sign up for the indigent healthcare program, they will, and they'll pay you a bonus for doing that. And if you fill the prescription and give it back to them, they'll pay you another $20. Right? The amounts of money here that are being used are very, very low at the beginning of the scheme. So these collectors use an army of indigent patients to obtain this medication, collect it up into a batch, and then try and clean it up and sell it to a criminal wholesaler who's got an actual Board of Pharmacy or Department of Business and Regulation pharmaceutical distributor license. And they then look at it, try and figure out if it all weighs the same, because one of the ways that people get caught is these things don't weigh right, right? They put in rocks instead of the real pills. Um, you try and, if you're a criminal and you're trying to make that empty bottle look real, you put Tylenol in it if it weighs the same as the actual HIV medicine. And then the wholesaler fakes up a transaction log showing where it came from, right? Completely made up. And there's only so many major wholesalers, and so they try and guess at how the medicine came through the supply chain and make it believable. And then they sell it to real bricks and mortar pharmacies, and often independent pharmacies. They're the victims of choice here. And they may have bought that bottle for $40 and filled it with Tylenol, but then they go and they sell it for 12% off of $3,000 a bottle. Again, the profit gap here, the amount of profit on each bottle is so much that it's obvious why they're in this business. It is an enormous sum of money to be made very, very quickly. Now, at the time at which the scheme was made public in early 2022, uh, we learned from court papers that they had seized over 85,000 bottles of suspect medication valued at $250 million, which I will tell you is the largest amount of money I've ever seen in a counterfeiting scheme. And at the time, there were 140 plus defendants. Now it's up to approaching $1 billion of product that they found that these entities moved, and there's almost 200 defendants. And this stuff definitely reached patients. In some cases, they supplied an antipsychotic, right? You've got an empty bottle, you've got to put something in it. Um, if you have an antipsychotic around, you can fill it with that if it's cheap. Maybe it's a generic, and so it costs almost nothing. And the patient that actually got that antipsychotic was left in a roughly catatonic state for hours until it wore off. It's particularly dangerous to imagine if you have controlled HIV because you take this pill every day, and for 30 days, because you don't pay attention to what the pills look like, you suddenly have uncontrolled HIV. You've endangered yourself. You've endangered your intimate partner. It's particularly scary to think of like all the harm that's been done, and much of which is hard to see. So there's a lot of parts with 200 defendants. You can imagine there was everyone from money launderers to marketers who had to be employed to keep this scheme going. The brand name products that were found in these warehouses are listed here, but I've been told by attorneys who work in enforcement with the manufacturers on the civil case side that they basically found stuff from every major manufacturer. So there's tons and tons more waiting to come out of these warehouses and out of these stories. And what's interesting is how this was prosecuted. First was a civil case, right? So it is a crime under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and several state laws to do what they did, right? To sell counterfeit or diverted medicine to patients, to pharmacies to dispense to patients. But it's also a civil crime because each of these each of these bottles, the pill, the insert paper, the safety insert, and the box that everything goes in is all part of a trademark and trade dress. And so in every case, when they fixed these bottles up or when they filled them with some other product, they committed a trademark violation. And the one of the great tools for enforcement of trademarks is the Lanham Act. Um, if you get sued under the Lanham Act, you're going to pay like two different ways for the amount of money you made selling a trademark infringing product, and then you're going to pay attorney's fees for the people who sued you. It is as expensive an event as possible, and I know that in some cases there were pharmacies that really leaned into the scam and sold thousands of bottles, and they're facing bankruptcy events, right? It is so much money. And what's interesting about this is that prosecuting under the Lanham Act gives you access to discovery. So the civil attorneys, for these manufacturers seize the email servers and all the email of the criminals involved. And mysteriously, I don't know how they found out about it, but the DOJ came in behind them and seized all of that material and proceeded to file criminal charges, and is one by one going through the same set of criminals and filing everything from money laundering to theft of medical products, which is a really interesting charge. So I have about maybe 10 minutes left, and I'm not going to go through a complete explanation of the Drug Supply Chain Security Act, but because that pharmacist used that serial number, I think it's worth talking a little bit about how that system works. And if there's questions, I do have the chat open. Maybe someone can refer them to somebody who can type them into the chat, because it's very difficult to hear audio in the room. And I'm happy to answer them in the time I have left. So the first thing to explain is that the Drug Supply Chain Security Act is not a magic package or technology, right? It's not scratch offs on the package. It's not edible micro tags that are in the pills or RFID tags on the bottles. Those can be used by vendors who help with DSCSA or inventory management, but they're not really part of the DSCSA itself. The DSCSA itself is really just a set of technology standards for how you serialize medicine packages and legal obligations. And it is only for the supply chain. There's no requirement that patients actually see any of that information. And that's actually, I think, a really brilliant recognition, because packaging changes and can change a great deal at the moment of dispensing, right? You get pharmacists who actually will break up medicine for people who have 3 or more medicines into individual little plastic bags that say, take Tuesday AM, Tuesday noon, Tuesday night. And if they had to reproduce the serial number of the medicine through that process, what I would call the last mile of dispensing to the patient, the system would become very complicated and costly at the pharmacy dispensing level. And pharmacists are the ones who are probably financially most strapped right now in the supply chain. So the DSCSA, I said it has obligations and standards. So here's the obligations. If you're, for a dispenser at least, you have to only purchase from authorized trading partners that have licenses. You can only purchase and sell things that have the serialized identifiers. You must keep records, what's called participating in product tracing, for the things that you buy and sell. You have to respond to requests for information. So if someone says, I'm doing an investigation about serial number 1234 on this bottle, you've got to actually answer if you've had it and where you got it from and where you sold it to. And finally, and this is the one that people don't catch, you have to suspect the medicine in your possession if it trips one of the suspicion filters that you have, investigate it, and quarantine it while you're doing that investigation. And that obligation is present now, even though we're still about a year away from the final step in the current rollout. that obligation for pharmacists exists now. And so pharmacists that were buying that sketchy medication who did not investigate it failed basically to meet that obligation. Um, there are some handouts, identifying people with licenses. There's a draft guidance from the FDA for that, and if this is something that you do for a living, you can read it. Trading products with identifiers is also an important one. That's a fake bottle there that you can see at the top. And it's got these 4 numbers and then a barcode. But not everything with barcodes is actually a serial number, right? So this is a vial of the Shingrix shingles vaccine that I actually got, which is how I was holding it, because I make everyone who injects me with something show me the bottle before I take it. And that code is not a serial number. It's actually the vaccine information handout. If you scan it, it'll take you to a website with information about the vaccine. And it turns out that not every bottle, not every pill is serialized with a serial number. This bottle comes in a pack of 8. And so the whole pack is got one serial number, but each individual vial does not have a serial number. Here's an example of a medicine I made up called confoundium, so I could use it as an example and talk about what are the parts of a NASCSA label that are new. Everyone knows about lot and expiration, but GTIN is actually sort of a unique product number. And serial number is the actual serial number. It is unique to that package. It is never, you'll never see 2 packages with the same serial number. And the beauty of this system is that we used to do recalls for counterfeit medication because somebody would take a label with a lot and expiration and copy that label and print it, 10,000 times and sell 10,000 fake bottles of medication with that same lot number. And so we would go and recall everything with the same lot number. Well, that's probably 150,000 bottles. So we took at least 140,000 bottles of good medicine out of the supply chain during that recall to try and find the 10,000 that were fake. Well, now you don't have to do that. Now, if somebody picks a serial number and counterfeits a label and makes 10,000 of them, you only have to recall all the bottles with that serial number. And so you don't take good medicine out of the supply chain in the same numbers, and you have the advantage that you don't cause shortages artificially by doing that recall. There's a couple things that are not serialized, and they're listed here. I just took that straight from the statute, so I'm not going to go into much detail. And there's some deadlines for which this stuff comes into place, but for everybody else except pharmacy dispensers, their deadlines have already passed. But for pharmacists, you're soon going to have to store this information when you receive it. So like you checking in product, your computer system will have to store the serial numbers. And you today have to respond to requests for investigations. And the statute doesn't require that the questioner have a subpoena. You actually have to answer within like 1 to 2 business days, and that's written into the federal statute. Investigating suspect product is the thing that most pharmacists don't realize they have to do today. And it's really straightforward. If it's suspect product, it's product that you have a reason to believe may be illegitimate. Illegitimate product is things that you would know. It's counterfeit, diverted, stolen, adulterated, not suitable for distribution. But the one that people don't get is that it's the product of a fraudulent transaction. You can be holding real medicine, but if someone lied to you about where they bought it from and that lie is in documentation, then that's the subject of a fraudulent transaction. And it's not safe to dispense at that point. There's a whole FDA handout on what is the appropriate suspicion. And like I said, for over a decade now, I've worked with pharmacists for whom they would look at it and go, yes, I already knew all that. I'm already suspicious whenever something looks wrong. But for those who are curious about what it would look like, that there's a handout for it. And when you have suspicious product, you basically have to quarantine it. You have to notify everybody that you bought that product from or sold it to, that you're doing an investigation. You have to pick out either 3 packages or 10% of what you have that's suspect to confirm it. You have to validate it and keep the records for 6 years. And if it's fine, you take it back out of quarantine, tell everybody, keep the records for 6 years. If it's not valid, if it turns out that there was in fact a fraudulent transaction, or it's actually counterfeit, or you found out it's diverted, you have to notify all your trading partners and file a 3911 with the FDA, which is probably just the beginning of a long bureaucratic adventure for you. One of the things that I showed you in the story about the up-labeled Procrit and Epigen was that it went through many, many, many entities, maybe as many as 10 or 11 before it finally got sold back into the legitimate supply chain. And if you are tracing product in that scenario, you have to make 10 or 11 phone calls. You have to send 10 or 11 emails. You've got to talk to 10 or 11 supply chain participants. And so I often tell pharmacists when I'm teaching them that if you find yourself being offered medicine that's been through many, many hands, if it turns out that you think it's suspicious, that's an added burden of time that you have to account for, because you're now going to have to make 10 or 11 phone calls, and whatever bargain you were getting may not be a bargain in that time. As a last thing, because I think I only have maybe a few minutes left, I just want to talk about one example that's really, really good. In the case where the counterfeit HIV and PrEP and Hep C medicines were sold, the transaction logs had one critical flaw in many cases that made it easy to spot the crime. And that crime was that the first entity that the transaction log listed it as being sold to, we call it the first sale, was to somebody who is not an authorized distributor. If you look at like Gilead's website or Janssen's or Pfizer's website, there's a specific set of people they only sell some medicines to. So if you're buying lidocaine, you only get it if you're in Texas from one of half a dozen wholesalers. Pfizer says we don't sell to anybody else in Texas except these half a dozen wholesalers. So if you get a NASCSA transaction log and the first sale is somebody not on that list, the whole thing's a fraud. You can put the whole thing in quarantine and never worry about it again, right? You do your paperwork and you're done. And so that is what I would recommend, that if you find yourself in the situation looking at this, is that you check that first, whether you're doing an inspection or whether you're actually holding drug products. I'm not going to go too much in about this, but returns are pretty simple under the NASCSA. Most of the returns don't require that you pass any transactional information, which makes life easier. All right, so I am pretty much done. I don't know how we can do questions because I can't really hear the audio in the room, but if they get typed into the chat, I can answer them. As just a parting shot, we're on TikTok, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. If you scan any one of these, you can find us, and if you scan that QR code below my face, it should put me into your contact list, which I hope is helpful. But that is how you can reach us, and we put out usually about a video a week about a counterfeit somewhere in this country, or cheerleading prosecutors and investigators who are doing this kind of work. And we would really appreciate your support by sharing our material. It's all we get judged on is how widely we educate healthcare professionals in the public and law enforcement. So thank you for your time, and I will hang out for a minute, and if there's no questions, please have a great rest of your conference.
All right, well, since anyone can't hear us well, I'm having our lead present so I think that was a great presentation, and I encourage you all to take a just a couple quick announcements. Networking lunch is next, and it's going to be starting at 12:30 to 1:30 right outside in the lobby area. And then at 1:30, we do have basically 3 different workshops. Our nutrition rounding program workshop will be in this area, this room, and it'll be for 2 hours. Otherwise, we do have 2 other just 1-hour sessions. So if you're going to attend the PMT, you're going to be able to just do that one workshop for 2 hours.